So good afternoon, Anthony. How are you?
Hello, Jamie. It's nice to see you.
You too, you too. And we met briefly during a protest in Trafalgar Square on a much more sort of prosaic topic of British politics. So it's great to have the chance to talk to you properly in a conversation today. So thank you very much for taking the time to join Sentientist Conversations. And I'm particularly excited to talk to you because much of academic philosophy can sometimes from the outside seem quite abstruse and difficult to penetrate. But you focused on the two most important questions, I think, in philosophy that this series is focused on, which is this question of what's real, how do we go about believing in epistemology, and what and who matters, the question of value and ethics. And I've long admired your honest, open, brave approaches to those topics and your rich public engagement too. So it's great to have the chance to talk to you. And as we've talked about briefly before, those are the two central questions of this series of conversations. And I have a bias in the conversation because I suggest we answer those questions with this really simple pluralistic worldview that I'm calling Sentientism, which I'd summarize as evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. So it answers that question about what's real in epistemology by suggesting we take a naturalistic approach, and it's answering the question of moral scope and who matters with this answer of sentiocentrism. We should have compassion and moral consideration for every sentient being. But I'm talking in these conversations with people who agree and disagree. So it would be fascinating to understand your own philosophical journey and where you are now. But before we get to those big questions, how would you best introduce yourself for people who don't know you, those rare people in my audience?
Well, the first thing I should say is that I agree wholeheartedly with what you describe as sentientism, very, very much so. It's exactly the same view that I take, which in a way I suppose is not surprising since we're both paid up humanists with a naturalistic kind of worldview. And in my own case, yes, absolutely. The two great questions about the nature of reality, how we know it, how we think about it, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the question of what matters in reality, what's of value, what's important, how we should behave. Those two questions are the two great fundamental questions of philosophy. And of course, they're related in an interesting way. You can see immediately that if somebody thought that it were a component of reality that there are supernatural agencies of some kind, gods and goddesses, and moreover that they have an interest in us and have views about what we should wear and eat and who we can marry and so forth. But then obviously the question of value is intimately linked to it. But equally, if one takes, as I think both of us do, a more naturalistic view of the reality question, that is that the universe is a domain governed by scientific laws, and doesn't have supernatural entities or agencies in it, then the question of value is very importantly a question that we have to address and answer. We have to think about our behavior, our relationships, our responsibility to other sentient creatures and the world that we share with them. And we have to come up with a well-reasoned, well-justified case for how we're to live and behave. So the two great questions are related in that way.
Yeah, thank you. So it's great to hear that we probably agree on a great deal. So it'll be interesting to understand the journey you went through to come to those views and how they link. So the first big question we like to ask is this one of epistemology and what's real. So for many of my guests, they tell a story about growing up originally in quite a naturalistic, maybe atheistic, scientifically minded household and society, or maybe one that was more mystical or spiritual or religious, and how that side of their thinking has changed over their lives, if it has. So it'll be interesting to know your own journey, and you can wind the clock back as far as you like to tell the tale.
Well, I was brought up in a completely non-religious household. There was no interest in religion, no bedtime prayers or church going or anything like that. Neither of my parents, my siblings, our household, completely uninterested in it. And it was only really at the sort of secondary level of education, when I was about 13, that I first rather seriously encountered the fact that other people had religious commitments of various kinds. There were Catholics and Protestants and Jews and Muslims and people like myself with no interest. And it was a little bit like, people who had a preference for one kind of candy as opposed to another. And until we had because it was a boarding school, and we had to go to chapel rather a lot. And it happened that we had a new, very evangelical chaplain come to the school. And he was a bit more forceful. He wanted people to wake up and take notice of what was happening in the chapel sessions, which we had, of course, all been ignoring until that point. And he galvanized me into asking him to give me some stuff to read. He gave me a very interesting reading list, which I worked my way through that following school holiday. When I went back to the school, I went to see him and I challenged him on it. I said, look, I've read everything you asked me to read, and I simply cannot understand how you, meaning you, a grown-up schoolmaster, can believe this stuff. And we had a debate in which it transpired that, of course, he had doubts and problems as well. He said that he prayed every day, oh God, help my unbelief. And he couldn't answer a point that really, ended the question as far as Christianity itself was concerned, namely that the Christian story is no different from any other Middle Eastern mythology in which a god makes a mortal maiden pregnant, and then she gives birth to an heroic figure like Hercules. Zeus was always doing this. So that sort of demolished the pretensions of Christianity for me. But then behind that, of course, is the deeper metaphysical question about whether there are any supernatural agencies, any gods, goddesses, supernatural beings in the universe, or associated with in some way if they're not spatio and temporal. And the thinking about that, because that is sort of very focal question in metaphysics, what kind of place is the universe, and what does reality consist in? And it seemed to me that people really didn't think about this very clearly. And the fact that religions keep their hold mainly by brainwashing the young. I mean, after all, the vast majority of people adhere to the religion of their parents, which is a powerful indicator of that fact. And that it's a very oppressive and sort of kidnapping world outlook. And it has very, very malign effects in our world. It gets in the way of scientific research, medical advances, understanding the nature of the biological realm, understanding evolutionary theory, for example. And it's a kind of mental prison. So when I got to think in terms of the social effect, political effect of religion, it prompted me, at any rate, to get interested in the great debate to which people like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, and others have contributed.
Thank you. So it sounds like your original engagement with the topic was more about the facts, the evidence, and the reason, and just the story didn't stack up as likely to be true. But then your later engagement was more driven by an ethical concern, or the concern of the harms of these types of worldview. And it's in these conversations that's been an interesting mix, because for some people it's actually the ethical problem they've spotted. It might be anti-Semitism or sexism or racism or something else that they've seen coming along with, or patriarchy that's come along with a religious worldview that's been the initial trigger. And for others, it's more been evidence and reason, and the facts don't stack up. But is that a fair way of characterizing how you engaged with it? It was first facts and evidence, and then it was ethics?
That is the sequence of events, yes. Because given the very small impact on my personal life as a boy growing up, the fact that we didn't go to church and we didn't hear sermons and people expressing views very much of a patriarchal or sexist or reactionary kind, based on their religious commitments, and that the impact of religious beliefs and practices on society, the practical impact. The rather different question, you see, because there are three different questions, aren't there? One is the metaphysical one about, do gods and goddesses exist? So that is about reality and existence. The secular question, the debate about whether or not the public square should be a secular domain in which all voices are heard equally and none are privileged and certainly none are dominant, that is a debate where the impact of religious beliefs and practices is really felt. And the secular impulse is one that wants to defend people against having other people's religious views imposed on them. And of course, for far too long, religious figures and authorities have had a automatic place at the head of the queue, at the top table in society, and an overwhelming influence on how societies are structured. And so the secularism matter is a very important one. But the third ism in play here is humanism. And this is how, if we are not going to have a religious outlook, we're not going to predicate our views about our obligations and duties and responsibilities on the fact that we've got brownie points to earn or punishment to avoid dished out by a god, then, we have to do that work. We've got to think about how we should live and relate. And that is at the very core of the humanistic outlook.
Yeah, thank you. When I'm talking about the sentientism idea, and I think the same thing runs through humanism, it's less about atheism as a specific topic. It's more about this naturalistic way of understanding the world, a sort of methodological naturalism that says the best way of engaging or understanding reality is to engage with it honestly. So in that sense, the decision about the supernatural, the question of a god, is, if you like, just one topic, and it's important and culturally so resonant and has such impact on the world. It's one most people will, turn towards as a first test, but it's not the only one. And I find this idea of methodological naturalism really interesting because almost everybody around the planet claims a commitment to it, and in practice has a commitment to it in some domains of their life. So even for most people who have a very strong religious faith, will still use evidence and reason and scientific knowledge in most other domains of their world, but they reserve this one particular domain to have a different way of thinking. And sometimes that can be a sort of backwards naturalism where they'll say, well, I do have evidence and reason to support my belief, although I would argue the approach they've taken is weirdly selective and is designed to support the belief they had in advance rather than being a genuine naturalism. Whereas others will just have a sort of fideistic, ultimately in a dogmatic approach, which says, here's a belief and I am choosing to believe it regardless of the evidence. So I find that interesting because on the one hand, it's frustrating why people can't be more consistent. But on the other hand, it gives me some hope because nearly everybody is, at least in part, a naturalistic sort of person and uses that method. But I guess I'm also interested in your view of humanists and atheists, because I also get the sense with some people in the humanist and the atheist movements and communities that they're so convinced they've got the answer right about the existence of God or not. And I agree with them. I think they have got that right, that they maybe overestimate how well they're applying their naturalism elsewhere. So there are many examples of atheists, and I dare say humanists, who have all sorts of damaging, harmful, and plainly unfounded beliefs in other areas of their world. So I'm interested in whether you've got a thought about, and observations about why many people in those communities struggle to apply this naturalistic approach more generally than the question of atheism and theism. And
well, one has to start at run up to this from an angle, which is to say that we human beings, by reflex, we talk about knowledge and we talk about proof and we talk about whether or not it can be known with certainty that there is a God or that there isn't a God, and so on. And that whole debate is extremely ill-formed, because if you were to take one of the world's leading physicists, let's say, and say to her, do you know anything? Do you actually know that, protons and neutrons and electrons and so on behave in the ways that the standard model tells us and so on? She should say, and she would say, I would guess, no, I don't know. But we have extremely powerfully attested theories which really work. We can apply them. But I cannot claim to know, because it is a principle in science that our theories, however well supported they might be, are nevertheless defeasible. That means that new evidence, better experiments, stronger arguments might come along and show us that we need to adjust or revise or even abandon our theories. So all claims about how things are in some domain are defeasible. So we shouldn't be dealing with the concept of knowledge at all, or rather we should recognize that the concept of knowledge is just a colloquial kind of concept. We say, everything that's in an encyclopedia is the current state of knowledge about that stuff. But we've already given the pass away there, because when we say the current state of knowledge, we're acknowledging that the state of knowledge might change. So knowledge isn't something which is final, complete, and certain. So instead of talking about knowledge, let us talk about rational belief. And let us notice that the word rational has as its first part ratio, which means proportion. So a rational belief is one that is properly proportioned to the evidence that you can deduce in its support. This is why, strictly speaking, you cannot say that you know that there are no fairies at the bottom of your garden. But what you can say is that it is profoundly irrational to believe it, because the evidence in its favor is just so weak, and the evidence against it is so strong. And exactly the same kind of consideration applies when people talk about gods and goddesses and the like. So if we refocus to talk about rational belief, and if we accept what Clifford, the 19th century philosopher of science, said, that it is wrong at all times to believe things on insufficient evidence, to accept and to act upon propositions for which there is very, very little evidence and a great deal of countervailing evidence, is just in the ethics of rationality, that is a sin against reason.
Yeah. So
I take that view. That's point number one. Point number two is that it concerns the concept of proof. Now, everybody, you often hear religious people saying, well, you can't prove that there is no God. Well, in fact, as a matter of fact, you can. And I'm going to do it now, okay? I can understand.
A bold claim.
You have to understand what's meant by talk of proof. In the mathematical and logical context, a proof is something that it would be irrational not to accept the conclusion of, providing that the argument form is valid and the premises are true, the premises are sound. So a proof in a formal language is something conclusive. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. It's given the understanding of the terms that occur in that syllogism, that proof is deductively valid and sound, and therefore not to accept the conclusion is to fail to understand the words or to be mad or something. So that's proof in the logical sense. But in the contingent empirical sense, proof means test. So if you go to a steel factory, you will see that every 100 rod or sheet that they've cast in the steel factory will be tested, or as they say, proved. That is, they will take a steel rod and they will load it and load it and load it until it fractures to see how much loading it will bear. This is called proving the steel. But we have sayings like the proof of the pudding is in the eating, that is the test. The exception that proves the rule. That doesn't mean the exception that shows the rule works. It's the exception that shows where the rule ends. You've tested the rule to see the limits of its application. So proof in the contingent sense means test. And there's that wonderful, wonderful example given by Carl Sagan, The Dragon in the Garage, which is an example of this concept of proof at work. So somebody says, I've got a dragon in my garage. You say, oh, I'd love to see a dragon. He says, well, you can't. This one is invisible. So you say, oh, well, can I hear it flapping its leathery wings? And no, this dragon is silent. Well, can I feel its hot breath? Don't dragons have fiery breath? No, this one doesn't have hot breath. Well, okay, let's put some talcum powder on the garage floor and see its footprints. No, this one never settles on. Now, every single test that you try to run, it turns out to be empty. And this is proof. This is a test of a claim, and the claim turns up empty. So you have proved that there is no dragon in the garage. And the dragon in the garage in our context here is the putative deity.
Yeah, thank you. And I like that approach, because there is this impression that people who have a naturalistic or a scientific worldview can sometimes get trapped in their own form of dogma because they've got so much convincing evidence that they become overfixed. But I'd agree that the absolute heart of a scientific worldview or a naturalistic worldview is that one of having views that are provisional because the evidence might change, and granting degrees of credence, if you like, is another approach to a potential belief, rather than it being a binary on-off thing that you say is absolutely true or absolutely not true.
Well, look, it's very interesting, in fundamental science, in particle physics, the Physics Review letters, which is a very, very authoritative physical journal in physics, they will regard as a discovery anything which has sigma 5. Sigma 5 is the degree of probability, which says that there's only a 1 in 3 million chance that you've got it wrong, or something's gone wrong with the experimental conditions or something like that. And so if something will be sigma 5 or better, then it would be regarded by Physics Review as a discovery. But you see, the people who would, after running the tests and the experiments and working out the theory. Once they've arrived at that point, there is still the 1 in 3 million chance. They still have to accept the potential to feasibility.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I think that's pretty clear. You take a natural,
the irrational of them.
Yeah, and I like that. I haven't heard that approach before, just describing the word rational. It doesn't mean following a logical sequence of steps to the point where you're 100% confident. It's having the ratio, the relationship between the power of the evidence and the level of confidence you have. And both, I think, they're sort of related, but different concepts. The concept of something being defeasible, or the concept of being open to new evidence that can change your degrees of credence, I think, are both important things that we need to remember are at the heart of a naturalistic way of thinking. So it feels like that's a pretty solid approach to your epistemology you take across all domains, I guess. So let's come on to this second question of what and who matters. And you've hinted at this already, that I agree that these two spheres of human thought are intimately connected. Some like to try and disconnect them and say, there's a Humean sort of is-ought boundary where never the twain shall meet. And others see there are rich, at least practical, links between the two. And I'm interested in your view about what the foundation of your ethics has come to be, and how did you get there, again, from the very early days? Because most of my guests started out with a religious default, then moved to a naturalistic way of thinking and had to adapt their ethics in line, whereas you started with a broadly defined naturalistic approach. So from the early days, again, how did you come to think about what matters, what a right and wrong, good and bad actually mean, and how would you frame those things now?
I should start this reply by saying straight away that I emphatically disagree with the Hume is-ought distinction on very, very good naturalistic grounds. So as follows. Very, very, very few people on the planet like to be cold, hungry, alone, in pain, oppressed, denied opportunities, treated unfairly, tortured, etc., etc. Very few people. And those few people who do like those things are weird. Okay, so this is just something that we could all universally agree. Now, immediately, that tells us something, therefore, about what to do in response to seeing that somebody is cold, hungry, alone, in pain, and the rest. Now, of course, the connection is not absolutely immediate, because we know that there will be plenty of people who will walk by somebody suffering in the street, who will run away from helping somebody who's in pain or in sorrow and so on. We know all that, and we know that cultural and in particular religious attitudes can either prompt or inhibit our responses to other people who will recognize that they're in certain kinds of distress or need. But in general, if we couple the fact that we human beings know sort of very, very basic things about what conduces to flourishing and what conduces to harm in human beings, and couple that with the thought that if you yawn, I yawn, if you laugh, I'll laugh, if you smile, I'll smile, that we have these, I don't know whether it's actually now established that mirror neurons play a big role, but I suspect they do in our ability to model other people's states of mind and how things are with them. But if you couple these things together, it begins to suggest that there is something rather significant about the fact that as social animals who need our relationships with one another, we need to give and receive affection and to be part of communities and families and to be with others, and that we flourish better if we are with others in those ways, and that therefore we have these evolved mechanisms for recognizing and interpreting other people's behavior and therefore their needs and being able to respond to them. And the fact that we do, the way parents respond to their children and siblings to siblings and so forth, when you see all this, it begins to suggest to you that actually there is a deeply naturalistic basis to the possibilities of moral behavior, and that it takes culture, takes beliefs to interfere with them and to mess them up, to promote some at the expense of others. So even though the links, between your mirror neurons and mine may not be so direct and sort of simply mediated, that if I see you stub your toe and say, ouch, that immediately I feel that I must respond sympathetically and do something about it. Although generally speaking, I think people do anyway. But even if the link weren't direct, there is a very plausible, very plausible story to be told about why it is that we, on the whole, behave towards one another in ways that are fundamentally decent. And this is an important point, this one, because I often say to my students, why is it that the news pages of newspapers are filled with reports of conflict and murder and problems and fraud and what have you? And the answer is because they're news, because they're sufficiently rare. The reason why the front page of the Times doesn't have shopkeeper is polite to customer is because this happens so many millions of times every minute of every day that the ordinary human transactions, which are the sort of basis of our getting on together, are on the whole very positive.
Yeah, thank you. So it seems like you'd make an unashamed connection between how an individual feels something as good or bad, their own experience, and the good or bad of an ethical question of what's right or wrong to do. Those things are quite intricately tied together.
They are indeed, and I think one thing I will agree with Hume about is that our motivations to action are emotional ones. In fact, I somewhat disagree with him that you can't have rational grounds for action as well. You remember he argued that the sort of Buridan's ass situation, when Buridan's the ass was placed between two equally delicious bales of hay and starved to death because he didn't have a reason to eat one rather than the other. To start with with one rather than the other. This idea that it's only emotions that can motivate behavior. Well, I don't quite agree with that, but I do think that in general, our motivations are emotional ones. But this is because there isn't a gulf between our reasonings and our feelings about things. I mean, the whole point of education and maturation is the reasoned education of our emotions, so that we can discipline some of them, our anger and our greed and our lust, and we can promote certain others, better feeling and sympathy for people who are in need or suffering, and that the direction of our emotions, our channeling of our emotions in more positive and less negative ways, is something that acts of reason can hugely help with. And we know from the historical data that that works, because we today don't go in for cockfighting and cruelty to animals as much as we did in the past. Human societies have moved on and become, in important respects, getting rid of slavery, trying to be more equitable in society, starting to be less sexist and patriarchal and racist. I mean, nowhere near having solved all those problems, obviously, but at least we're trying to head in the right direction. And this shows that education and culture and reflection and the use of reason to try to govern and redirect our emotions is an important feature of us.
Yeah. And do you think that link between the sort of intuition and reason relates to the distinction between a sort of descriptive ethic that just describes through a process of evolution how we've come to be how we are as animals, the compassion a mother feels for the child and so on, from that descriptive stance to a more confident normative stance, which says, okay, I understand our evolutionary context and why we might feel these ways, but what actually is right and wrong in a normative sense? Is it reason that bridges that, or is
well,
that a different topic?
Yeah, I think that everything is kind of multifactorial, isn't it? So I am indeed taking the view that our descriptions of how things are in states of affairs in the world or with people contain within them considerations that are relevant to how we respond and how we act. As I say, it may not be absolutely direct, but there's always some, a set of supplementary premises that you can bring to bear here, which will show you how you get from a description to how you get to a prescription. So, just to give you an example, I see somebody fall in the street in a way which indicates that they've been rather badly hurt. So, the description of the state of affairs is this person has had an accident and they're in great pain. Now, when I arrive at the conclusion that there's something I should do about it, so I should phone an ambulance and I should, go to that person's help and try to comfort them until an ambulance arrives and so on, in between the recognition of the facts of the case and the judgment about what I should do, there will be some very, very obvious things that would make sense to anybody. The idea that to see a fellow human being in distress imposes some kind of obligation on us. Well, why? Well, I mean, part of that story is going to be because you hope the same thing might happen to you. So that's the self-interest aspect of the story. But we know also from plenty of evidence that it's not only, or even indeed always, self-interest. Even as one factor among others that motivates us. Mencius, for example, a long time ago, and he was of the view, as some of the earlier Confucians were, that human beings are basically benevolent. Now, if you think about that word, benevolent, wishing well to others. And he said, when you see a child about to fall into a well, little infant, it's clambering up on the lip of the well, about to fall in, you don't think to yourself, what should I do about that? Or would I want somebody to rescue me if I were going to fall into a well? No, you just go and rescue the child. You don't go through those calculations. And this says something about us, which I think is beautifully captured in an anecdote told by the essayist William Hazlitt. He was describing a walk that he went on in Devon, in Dorset, in Devon, with Coleridge, the poet Coleridge. And they got to this little seaside village, fishing village, where they were told that the night before there'd been a violent storm and a boy had been swept out to sea in the storm. And that at the risk of their own lives, the men in the fishing village had gone to try to rescue him. And Coleridge asked them, well, why did you do that? And why did you risk your own lives to go and save the boy? And the man replied, because we have a nature towards one another. And I think in that remark, it's a very richly packaged remark, that because of the interesting ambiguities of the word nature in there. We have a nature towards one another. It really captures something about how human beings see and respond to one another. And it's a very optimistic thing, by the way, because racism is much, much more difficult to be a believer in or a practitioner of once you know individuals. Once you meet people from other ethnicities, other parts of the world, you get to know them or work with them, become friends with them, see into their lives a little bit. It becomes much, much harder to treat them just as a kind of blob, a group, and to have that kind of very insensitive view towards. I think that's because all human beings have a nature towards one another if that opportunity to express it is given.
Yeah, thank you. And to my mind, it almost seems definitionally true of what we mean by ethics and morality, in that their essence, once you put a divine command theory or an extreme nihilist view or a relational view that just says whatever we agree is by definition right, is once you put those things to one side, and I think we can and we should, ethics and morality seems to be centrally about whether and how we care for others. And as you said, benevolence in a sense is saying, well, if you value your own experience, you don't like stubbing your toe, you don't want to be hurt, you want to be loved, you want sustenance, then ethics is my choice to value that too. So yeah, it seems almost sort of definitionally true with a common sense view of what ethics and morality is, and how we might feel about that and work on it can be a combination of intuition and emotion and immediate reactions, but also we can refine that with rationality and clear thinking and intellectual work too.
There's an interesting step to be taken in connection with the self-interest argument. Self-interest argument, of course, was made respectable by J.L. Mackie in his book Ethics, where he talked about enlightened self-interest as being a perfectly valid motivator for treating others well, that you want to be treated well yourself. But I like to rephrase it in the following way. I like to say, that I don't like to be cold and hungry, and I don't like to be in pain. I don't like to be abandoned when I'm in need. I think if I start by saying I, as a human being, have the human aversion to pain and cold, then immediately I've universalized it. Immediately I've said something which makes it incumbent on me to respond to other people who are lonely and cold in the appropriate way. It's not about me, it's about what it is to be human. By the way, Jamie, an interesting point there. You used the conjunctive phrase ethics and morals. And so it is a bit of a campaign on my part to persuade people that these terms are actually different.
Yeah.
So if you look at the etymology of these terms, the word ethics comes from an ancient Greek word ethos, which means character. And ethical reflection is reflection on how you answer the question, what sort of person should I be? How should I live? What values should shape and direct my life?
So it's more centered on us as the moral agent.
Yes, on oneself as an agent. Morals, well, the word morality, in fact, derives from a coining by Cicero. And Cicero was, he had a very sophisticated understanding of Greek philosophy. He'd studied it, and he wanted to sort of parlay a lot of the Greek philosophical thinking into the Latin conversation. And he took a word which in Latin is mos, 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 moris, plural mores, which we still use in English, mores, to mean customs and so on. And he adapted this term moralia. And this was about behavior. Our moral considerations are about how we behave towards one another. Independently of what your character is like, you could do a moral or an immoral thing, you see, because it's only about the action and about the consequences of the action.
Yeah.
So very familiar moral theories like utilitarianism or deontology are just about the nature of the action and its consequences, whereas ethics is about the character of the agent, the character of the individual. Now, normally speaking, a person who has, very sort of sound ethical character is going to have good morals because your morality will tend to flow from your ethics. But sometimes even good people might do bad things. And indeed, that rather frequently happens. I think that may be the general story about human beings, that most human beings are basically good, but they sometimes do, sort of shitty things. So this just shows you that there is a disconnect there. And it's important to keep that clear. And among the reasons why it's important to keep it clear is that cultural circumstances, cultural conditions very, very much affect the question of our behavior, our morality. And if you think about, I would just take an example of the crackdown after the Second World War on the gay community, tragically, resulting in the suicide of Alan Turing and so on. But there was a big crackdown and a big pushback from the gay community. So around about the middle of the 50s, the Wild Blood, book about the sort of unfairness of it all, and that brought about changes in the law in the 1960s. So there was an example of how a moral, even indeed a moralistic attitude about homosexuality in our society was confronted by a set of ethical considerations, and the ethical considerations changed the course of morality. So, it's this kind of interesting tension between conceptions of ethics and conceptions of morals. And historically, of course, societies become more liberal and then more puritanical, then more liberal again. The pendulum swings backwards and forwards. But the great ethical question, what sort of person should I be? How should I live? Is invariant throughout history.
Yeah, that's a fascinating distinction because I know some people use the terms interchangeably, but I like that distinction. And it's a nice link to this second part of the ethical question here, because I think you and I would share this sort of grounding for our morality, if you like, and then have that flow backwards through into our ethics and vice versa. Is that ultimately it's about our concern for others and how they are and how they value their lives. But one of my concerns about ethics, I guess, in that sense, that focuses very much on the agent and what should I do, and maybe also deontological approaches that are more focused on systems of rules and so on, is that if we focus too strongly on the agent, we can almost forget the moral scope of our consideration as well, and we maybe misidentify the valid moral patience. Which consequences, which moral outcomes should we be concerned about? So you can imagine situations where someone might well be a very virtuous person. They're kind and courageous and compassionate, But if they don't recognize a certain set of moral patience, they could still put themselves in an immoral position. So that's another really interesting journey that my guests talk about, is that question of moral scope. Again, how did they start out? We have these intuitions about family and friend, and then we go through a journey of thinking about humans like us, maybe humans that aren't like us, maybe all of humanity, and maybe beyond. So it'd be interesting to know your story there, but partly because you grew up in a very interesting context where you saw some very direct challenges to intrahuman ethics as well. So how did you go through that journey of thinking about the scope of moral consideration and moral patience?
I'll come to that just in 1 second, just to add a point about the ethical dimension, which is that, of course, you may remember that in the schools of antiquity, so really when we're thinking about ethics, we're thinking about Socrates, Aristotle, the Stoics, the Epicureans, and so on, who were very focused on trying to answer these questions in a very secular way. I mean, they weren't religions, I don't think about. But one key thing for them was the great importance of self-knowledge. Over the gateway into the Delphic oracle was know thyself. This idea of knowing what one is. So when you ask the question, what sort of person should I be? What kinds of things am I already? And one of them is I'm a social being. Now, what does that mean? That means that I need these connections with others, and that a good and worthwhile life is going to be one in which, therefore, there are good and worthwhile relationships. So already the moral is already implicated in the ethical in that sense. And I say that our morality flows from our ethics. A really, responsible kind of set of ethical reflections would have right in the very earliest premises facts about our connections with others.
But there's an interesting example from antiquity, because many of those people who were thinking in really deep, original ways about how to be a virtuous person many of them were fairly unquestioning about the fact that slavery was just accepted. So they were working very hard on being virtuous, but unfortunately had put an entire group of valid moral patients in a different category that meant they just weren't considered. And I guess that's the context for this second question about moral scope and
Indeed,
who gets lucky enough to count in our considerations.
Indeed, well, you make a very good point. Aristotle thought that plenty of people were just natural slaves and needn't be bothered about in that respect. And you're quite right. I mean, the point that you're raising really is about the degree to which the ethical, thinking of it in those terms, leads to individualism and a kind of blindness to the needs of others. Now, that you raised the point about the context of my early life. Well, I spent my childhood, my early life in Africa, in what is now Zambia and Malawi, right on the border of the Congo. My father was working out there, and so he was a sort of expat family out there. People tend to lump the whole of Africa into one thing, or even just sub-Saharan Africa into one thing, and they don't recognize that. Well, South Africa, of course, is a completely different story, having been settled a long time ago by Dutch and then French, and then taken over by the Brits during the Napoleonic Wars. But there were two British colonies in Africa, Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, and Kenya. And the people who went out there to settle, to live. That was where they were going to make their lives. The bits of Africa that we were in were protectorates. They weren't colonies, and people didn't go out there to settle. So, like my dad, for example, was more or less there on contract. And therefore, it was a much more evanescent, less rooted sort of feeling of people were coming and going and kind of passing through. So it was kind of very deracinated sort of experience in a way. And also sort of pretty primitive conditions also. No television. I don't know whether that makes it primitive, but anyway, we were thrown on our own resources a good deal, because you can't go for country walks in the middle of Africa, get eaten by lions. So I was brought up in those circumstances, and my mother, who was a very, very difficult character, hated it in all respects except one, which was that she could have lots and lots of servants. And so she had a very, very easy life. And she was horrible to the servants. She was a dreadful employer of them. And anyway, I was sort of really brought up by the servants that we had. And they were really my family. I was incredibly fond of them and spent most of my time with them. And it was a realization, in fact, when I was quite a small toddler, that I didn't have the same skin color as they did. I mean, to begin with, of course, I simply didn't notice or took it for granted. But then I noticed that I wasn't like them, and I became increasingly conscious from an early age of the great difference in the way they were treated. And I have to say that the way that Africans were treated in what is now Zambia and in Nyasaland, which became Malawi, was very, very different and far better and with more respect and consideration than non-white people in South Africa. We went a few times to South Africa and were horrified by but a water fountain, not for non-whites, and I mean, it was really quite sort of shocking. So from an early age, I was very conscious of this. And I'll tell you a story that we had a sort of head servant, a man called Johnny Penza, of whom I was extremely fond, and he was very fond of me. I used to have a lot of night terrors when I was a child, and when I did, he used to come and sleep on the floor next to my bed to keep me company. But he told me a story one day which sort of sums it up. And the story is that God decided one day that he wanted all the people of the world to be white like him. Okay, so just for starters, right? You don't have to go anywhere else. But anyway, he wanted all the people of the world to be white like him. So he sent the cheetah to the people of the north, and the cheetah is very, very swift, and it went to the people of the north, and they all came down to the lake. This is Lake Nyasa, and they bathed in the lake, and they became white like God. So the hare was sent to the people of the east, and the hare is swift, but not as swift as the cheetah. So by the time it had summoned the people of the east and they got to the lake, the waters of the lake were all churned up and were muddy. So they bathed in it and came out brown. But it was the chameleon that was sent to the people of the south, and the chameleon moves very, very, very slowly. And by the time the message got to the people of the south and they come up to the lake, there was no water left, only damp sand. And they could press the soles of their feet and the palms of their hands on the damp sand. And that is why a black man has pink palms to his hand and soles to his feet. Now, that is absolutely heartbreaking, that story. It's heartbreaking and enraging. And enraging because it was the fault of the missionaries. I don't know, somehow or other, this story had been formulated out of what the missionaries had said. I didn't think they came up with the story. It was probably an African-inspired story. But what it contains and what it implies is just too awful. It kind of embodies, just something about racism and colonialism and all that, which is unspeakable.
Yeah, it's tragic.
So that was my early environment. My father, who was a very, very kind man and a sort of generous-minded man, was in no way a racist, but my mother was. She was the most appalling racist. It was just, very unpleasant. So sort of quite early on, those things had become an aspect of my own feeling about how the world works and shouldn't work.
Yeah. And so I guess that was one of the instructive experiences that led you to, I guess, this broad, universal, humanistic compassion that has led many people around the world to sign up to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and to recognize, in theory, if not in practice, that all humans matter. And it's imperfect, probably needs a bit of a rewrite. We've got so far to go to actually implement the principles that underlie that. But that's a stance that I think we can count as human progress, that at least in theory, most countries around the world have signed up to that. But there's an equally critical question, which is about going beyond that. And for many people, this is a tougher challenge because we're talking about going beyond the species boundary and learn to empathize or have compassion for non-human animals, for example. So what journey have you gone through there? Because you mentioned right at the start that you share this sort of sentiocentric compassion. How did the journey of thinking about non-human animals in terms of moral scope happen for you?
Again, so multifactorial in the sense that there are a number of different considerations that feed into it. And it's always a very interesting starting point to take somebody who has the self-interest view and to say to such a person, even if you're just interested in yourself, you've got to realize that the crucial interdependence of everything on the planet. And this is, all the way from the microbial ecology of the soil, all the way through all the different species, plant and animal. And everything is so crucially interlinked and so mutually balancing that if you weren't responsible in your behavior towards not just other sentient creatures capable of feeling pain and fear, feeling pleasure and satisfaction and so on, which applies to anything down to a vole or a rat or a chicken, but to see that we have a kind of responsibility to ourselves and our fellows. This is just on the self-interest argument, to look after the planet. But then what one, I think, should needs to go further and to begin to recognize that there is a rich concept of intrinsic value. There's intrinsic value in nature, in not just instrumental. So we don't just not cut down trees because they're so important to carbon capture and the like, but we don't cut down trees because, as living things, as things that are natural inhabitants of our planet, they have you could even phrase it by saying they have a right to exist and to be protected. And the language of rights there may seem to be overextended, but we extend rights to unborn fetuses and to demented elderly people and so on, people who are not, or things that are not persons in the forensic sense, that they can exercise responsibilities and own property and be treated as potential agents, but just things that have a value. Their existence is something which has a value in its own right and not merely instrumental. And once one begins to recognize that admittedly is a harder argument to make out. But once one includes that in one's repertoire, then the sense of responsibility that we have to non-human sentient creatures and to the planet as a whole really becomes something very, very difficult to escape. That feeling becomes very difficult to escape.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess the way I think of it is there's almost a spectrum of choices we can take, and you can go from an anthropocentric view that says humans are what matter intrinsically. You can go beyond that to where I am, which is a sentiocentric view, which says that any being that has the capacity to suffer or flourish matters intrinsically. You can go beyond that to a biocentrism that says non-sentient living things, and I would include plants in that, for example, matter intrinsically, or even beyond that to an ecocentrism that says ultimately everything matters: rocks, rivers, trees, habitats, the earth has Gaia. And what I'm suggesting with this sentientist idea is that the most important thing is that we don't exclude any of the sentient beings from moral consideration. But you can go further if you want to. So I'm more worried about excluding sentient beings and their suffering from consideration than I am about extending it beyond sentience. But personally, I do take quite a strict sentiocentric stance myself, and this might be one area where we disagree, because I would absolutely agree that because of the rich interdependencies that we have on the planet we all live on, I share this really powerful concern for ecosystems and the environment and rocks, rivers, trees, and all of those things. But for me, that concern is an instrumental one, not intrinsic. So the reason I care about the tree is because of the ecosystem it provides, because the links it has within the physics of our geography, because of the aesthetic pleasure that you and I will get from looking at it in the forest. But I don't think it has intrinsic value in the same way as a pig, a chicken, a fish, a cow, or a human. And I guess my concern is that the modern environmental movement, I think, is an interesting case study here, because the center of gravity, I think, of the modern environmental movement is we've gone from this sort of anthropocentric concern, universal human rights, that's fine, and we've jumped to this sense of now we need to, in a richly generous, interconnected way, care about the entire environment. But often when you scratch the surface of it, it's really just a veneer on anthropocentrism, because the reason we care about the environment is because of the risks it presents to us and because the ecosystem services we as humans need. And you can see that it's a veneer for many people, because while extending this supposed compassion for all the entire ecosystem, they still are conveniently carving out moral consideration for some very obvious moral patients that I see are sentient. So they will express a concern for the environment writ large. I care about a blade of grass or a rock or a river. but will still exclude in practical terms actual sentient beings. So I guess my appeal is that even if people have this really generous ecocentric moral scope, that surely we still have to reserve some degree of privileged position for the sentient beings that can actually suffer and flourish in their own right. And that's why, I might cut a blade of grass without too much thought about the moral harm I'm doing to it, because I don't think the blade of grass cares about being cut, whereas a non-human animal very definitely does. So I guess that's my appeal to people with an ecocentric view is, okay, fine, but sentience still counts over and above that in terms of that capacity to suffer and flourish. But I don't know what you think of that observation.
Well, I mean, if the point were that there are, priorities, so you prioritize a sentient creature over a blade of grass, I think that's right. I mean, there has a bigger claim, and there has much better reasons for making that claim. So I would agree with that.
Mm.
I should point out, by the way, that Dan Dennett always says, and I think it's a very good point, that whenever one uses the word surely in an argument, it almost always indicates the weakest point in the argument. And
it's a bad habit. I will try and stop.
And it happens that somebody could say, without being a swivel-eyed person who talks to his potted plants in the hopes that they will grow taller, the sort of King Charles phenomenon, I suppose you have to say King Charles now. But without that, I don't think it's all that clear where the boundaries of sentience lie. And we've learned a huge amount, for example, about the community formed by trees and fungi in woodland, and about the communication that goes on, and how trees at one end of a wood afflicted by some kind of parasite can communicate to trees elsewhere, and you start coming up with defense mechanisms before the parasite gets there, and so on. And this begins to raise questions about the boundaries of application of certain terms that we use. And the terms that we use, I mean, even the term sentience itself, in a way, has a history which is very anthropocentric. And indeed, I remember, drawing a distinction some time ago between the agent and the patient, and defining an agent as somebody who conscious of, being in a position of making choices and deciding and acting on those decisions, and a patient as being anything worthy of moral regard in a sense which can be explained for the context of that patient. So a chicken is a moral patient because it can be afraid and feel pain.
It has its own perspective.
Yeah. And but it's not an agent, so we don't expect it to behave in ways that are conformable to our view of agency. But nevertheless, we should take its interests into account. And then it then occurred to me that, in fact, the whole environment, everything in the environment. You see, you said your anxiety about the sort of general, ecosystem person is that ultimately this comes down to being self-interested. Well, that wouldn't work actually for them, because the tigers, if the tigers cease to exist, or indeed any of the many species that have gone out of existence over the last few centuries because of anthropogenic climate change, have not made a difference to us personally yet. So you couldn't say that I'm only interested in the ecosystem because of my own interest, because there are plenty of parts of it that don't. Rather, in parallel with the point that you've made. But you could agree that we should privilege more over less sentient things, but we should also consider that the boundary of application of this concept of sentience might be very, very much greater than we think.
I completely agree. And that's one thing I do have to remind myself of, because personally I'm reasonably skeptical of the claims of plant sentience. I think the communication and the behavior is much richer than we thought. But I think it's fair to say this current scientific consensus thinks it's pretty unlikely. But that's not the point of sentientism. So sentientism doesn't tell us which things are sentient. It just says take a naturalistic, prudent approach, as we were saying earlier on, to work it out. So in that sense, if we discover robust evidence that plants, for example, are sentient, that renders biocentrism and sentientism basically the same thing, because if all living things are sentient, then those two groups collapse into one another. And I think that's I guess the suggestion with sentientism is that it says whatever sentience is, and wherever it is, even in plants, it matters. It's the morally salient characteristic for qualification as a moral patient.
Well, that requires of us that we get very clear about what you mean by by sentience, because you kind of suggest a certain degree of consciousness or maybe self-awareness or something.
Yeah, I describe it, and this is another fascinating space, and I don't know if we'll have time to get into it, but these terms are, as always, fuzzy and used in slightly different ways. But I tend to think of it almost as the morally salient subset of consciousness, partly because lots of people will bundle extra things into consciousness. So they will take subjective awareness, but they will also add in an ability to be creative or advanced planning for the future or some other cognitive capability. So consciousness can end up quite a rich, bundle of stuff. Whereas I think of sentience, and I think this is the most commonly used definition, is it's the capacity for experience. And most people would say it's the capacity for valenced experience. So it's an experience that the being itself would value in a positive or a negative way. We might call all of the positive valence flourishing. That could be physical pleasure, but it could also be love, a sense of connection, aesthetic joy. And we could call all the negative stuff suffering, again, physical pain, but also existential angst, worry, hunger. So that's how I'd describe the core of sentience, is this capacity for valenced experience. That would be my suggested definition.
Okay.
But what that leaves open is, okay, what actually is it? So that's one of the fascinating things in this series of conversations, is I've talked to many people with very different philosophies of mind. So I've talked to panpsychists and more materialist, functionalist people and delusionists and so on. And it's quite interesting that even with a broad variety of philosophies of mind about what sentience actually is it an illusion? Is it information processing? Is it some sort of essential, ineffable essence that's the foundation of all physics? It's still possible to come back to a sort of common sense recognition that whatever it is, if an entity values something positively or negatively in its own experience, we can count that as sentience and then decide to care about that as a morally salient phenomenon.
Well, I'm certainly very, very sympathetic to the idea that we should treat with genuine, real, contentful moral concern anything capable of sentience in the way that you've described it. The concept that you're working with there is one that sits between the sensitivity of a heliotropic plant to the position in the sky of the sun on the one hand, and on the other hand, something that would legitimately be describable as conscious. Consciousness seems to imply a kind of self-awareness in a way, and the idea of valenced experience, that is, experience of a relationship with other things in an environment, does seem to carry the idea of some kind of self-awareness or awareness of that fact. And so
I think you have to be aware of the experience you're having to have a valence of it. So again, I think it's at least a minimal basic form of consciousness. Yeah.
Well, I suppose a panpsychist who thinks that everything is conscious in some sense might offer you a way out here to team up with the pan ecologists.
Potentially so, but one of the things I find interesting with the conversations I've had with panpsychists is that, and there's probably 3 or 4 of them in this series so far, is that while I've described sentience as a sort of subset of consciousness, there's another way I think of thinking about it, because the panpsychist conception of consciousness seems to me to be different. Because if I imagine type of consciousness that a photon might have, and I'm not a panpsychist myself, so I don't ascribe to this view, but by definition, the consciousness of this photon, this sort of very minimal self-awareness, whatever it might be, has no vision, no language, no auditory sensations, no nociception, no experience of pain. No, a photon doesn't even have a sense of time, because time doesn't pass for photons. So when you strip all of these things out, and a panpsychist will say, okay, but there's still a minimal micro consciousness left for this photon. I think it's interesting to say, well, but can that photon suffer? Can it have a valenced experience. You might say it has some minimal micro consciousness, some basic level of self-awareness, but I'd suggest that in that case, maybe it's conscious if you've defined it that way, but it's not sentient because it cannot have a valenced experience because it has none of the perceptual input and it has none of the processing capabilities that you or I or a pig or a chicken or a fish have. So in that sense, sentience almost detaches from a panpsychist version of consciousness because it's so basic. Personally, I don't think that warrants being called conscious at all. But if they want to call it conscious, then it's actually an insentient consciousness because you can't harm a photon or an electron in a morally meaningful way. So yeah, it's quite an interesting disconnect depending on which way your philosophy of mind goes. And so I've spoken to Luke Roloffs, who's a fascinating mind, but their panpsychism essentially leads them to a very similar moral stance to me because they think ultimately a photon or electron is minimally conscious, but they agree with me they're not sentient, whereas they do think that both pigs and chickens and fish and humans are both conscious and sentient. So we ethically come back to the same place, for example, both being vegan, even though we have radically different philosophies of mind. So it's an interesting tangent.
Well, I mean, border disputes, boundary disputes are inevitable in this arena where the concepts in question are themselves very, very complicated with fuzzy boundaries.
Yeah.
But I think go back to our much earlier point about the sort of multifactorial character of a view that one might take. So I can see a very plausible account to be given of somebody who says, well, my thought is that we should regard ourselves as morally responsible for and therefore part of the endeavor to protect the whole planet. Because I'm a sentientist about sentient beings and think, but also because I've got a self-interested aspect to it, which is that everything on the planet is mutually interdependent. And so you could have a family, a repertoire, a menu of reasons why you should have the whole story without there having to be a kind of one univocal account given of the justification for it.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I like that pluralistic approach. You can take many different angles. So. Well, let's move on to this final crazily big question about how can we make a better future? And ultimately, that's why I think it's so important to have a well-grounded epistemology and a well-grounded ethic, because it seems that all of the human-caused harms we face ultimately come down to either a failure of compassion, we've chosen not to care about a being we should care about, or that we've just got something wrong about reality. So compassionate people, as you said before, can do terrible things if they make epistemological mistakes, but people who have a really good quality epistemology can make terrible mistakes if they ethically exclude valid moral patience. So I guess that's why this question looms large, and I address it at the end. And it strikes me from many of these conversations that lots of the problems we're facing today, as humanity, but also sentientity, if you like, sentient kind, aren't necessarily that technically difficult to solve or even philosophically difficult to solve, because there are always lots of challenging problems around the edges, but the core cases are often quite clear about what we should really be doing. But the problems are of social norms and human psychology and politics, doing the right things. So I'm interested in how you think of the role of philosophy, epistemology, and ethics in driving us towards a better future. And there's a particular use case that I find frustrating in that, as we were saying earlier, in a way, I have a higher expectation of atheists and humanists and free thinkers and skeptics because we're committed to using evidence and reason to finding a more compassionate, positive way forward. But many humanists and atheists do seem to have a bit of a blind spot around this topic of non-human animal ethics. So when I've spoken, for example, at the American Humanist Association conference recently and many UK humanist groups, I will generally get really warm, positive engagement, and people are open to examining humanism itself and saying, are we doing this right? Should we go further? But at the same time, for other people, it seems to be like kryptonite. So people who are deeply committed to a naturalistic worldview will warp their epistemology and warp their ethics to try and justify harmful social norms they grew up in. So that's just one case study, really, of where epistemology and ethics can be warped, I think, in harmful ways. But whether you want to take on that case study or think more broadly about the role of philosophy in making a better world, how do you think about how we can get to a better future?
So, just to pick up your point about how the problem is not one that is difficult in principle, but it is immensely difficult in practice. The solution is education and democracy. So if people were really, really well informed and really clear ideas about things, really understood, then it would be very hard for them to be racist and sexist and mean so that's a bit utopian. Their belief. I mean, obviously, some people would still. They say, "Okay, I understand all this stuff, but I'm still, I still don't like people of other races, or I still don't like, men, or whatever it might be." But in general, I think the more informed and better educated people are, the more aware they are, the better they understand things. And there's a key point, because the step beyond information is understanding the implications of that information, of connecting the dots and really grasping how things are. That would be an enormous advance if people really did that. The second point, the point about democracy, which sounds like a cliche, but in fact, real participation, people really having a say, people having an input into what happens in, a kind of difference making input into what happens in their lives, being heard, being treated as, on a par with everybody else, not, having a wasted vote in a constituency because the electoral system doesn't reflect genuine diversity of choice and preference and so on. But, to be a genuine participant and to have an equal say with everybody else, and to be very well informed. And by the way, a really functioning democracy needs an informed electorate, which is another deficit that our world suffers from. But so if we had those two things together, we are never ever going to get perfection. Okay, so we are not going to, we can't hope for perfectibilism, but we can hope for very substantial meliorism, making things a hell of a lot better if people were more thoughtful, more informed, and more effectively participating. So that would be, I think, given human nature, given the human condition, given the constraints, given the fact that we are, not in a position to say, well, I wouldn't start from here, kind of, thing. That seems to me to be the way to go. Seems a very, in one way, a sort of rather modest proposal, even though I acknowledge the enormous practical difficulty of it. But everything that you and I do, so you, by running these videos, this series of conversations, are providing information and perspectives and points of view. And there may be many people who've seen these videos of yours who've been well informed by them and changed their mind about some things, which is great. I write and teach in order to, put my little pixel into the overall picture with that aim in view. And I feel that it's very important that we should keep on making a noise about this, saying how important it is that people should be informed and reflective, and how important it is that we should get our social institutions and political institutions right, so that people can feel that they genuinely do have more of a stake and can make a difference. And that if they're going to be responsible about both the stake and the difference, that they have to continue to educate themselves all their lives long, get more and better informed, and to think, to accept that challenge. Famously, and it's something I quote very often, Bertrand Russell said, most people will rather die than think, and most people do. And that is the world's tragedy.
Yeah, thank you. It's coming back to those fundamentals, education, democracy, and I would argue running good quality naturalistic epistemology and a sentiocentric moral scope, at least through both of those institutions. And I agree that with a better quality of epistemology, it's harder to have warped ethics, and vice versa. The more we care and the more we extend that compassion, the more motivated we are to understand reality to make it better. So that's been an inspirational conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me on Sentientist Conversations.
Thank you for having me, Jamie. Thank you for having me. It's been a great pleasure.
It's a real pleasure. What's the best way people following you, buying your books, learning more about your work, and staying in touch?
Well, I suppose I do have a website, just acgrayling.com or something. And then there's stuff on, usually Amazon has an author page, so with all the latest books on it.
Brilliant. I will include the links in the show notes. Yeah. Well, thank you again so much. It's been a genuine pleasure. Stay in touch.
All the best. Bye, Jamie.
Thank
Take
you.
care.